410 and the Romans have left Britannia, sort of. They probably intended to come back, but they were too busy being conquered by Germanic barbarians. It should be noted straight out of the gate that early 5th century Britain is very difficult to understand since nobody wrote about it. What is known comes from three major sources. The first was written by a 6th century monk called Gildas, the second by an 8th century Northumbrian monk called Bede, and the last is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. More on them in a bit. So neither the exact details of events nor their dates are known, but Britain was subject to waves of invasion and settlement by several groups of Germanic peoples in the early 5th century. These were the Angles, who were from here, the Jutes, who were from here, and the Saxons, from here. Collectively, these people are referred to as the Anglo-Saxons. There are many myths and legends surrounding their arrival, but the most famous is that of Hengist and Horsa, who landed here in Kent sometime around the year 450. For the sake of simplicity, those who were living in Britain before the Anglo-Saxon arrival are referred to as Britons, but be aware that many did not see themselves as part of some great collective. The same can be said of those from the continent, who are often described with the umbrella term Germanic. According to Gildas's interpretation of events, a tyrant king of the Britons, sometimes called Vortigern, was having problems with raids from the Picts and the Scots. He called for help from the Saxon mercenaries who were led by Hengist and Horsa. The Saxons defeated the Picts and asked for greater payments. When the Britons could not provide it, they revolted and began to conquer the island. The story continues that early on the Britons were consistently beaten back until the emergence of a leader called Ambrosius Aurelianus, who, around the year 500, defeated the Saxons at the Battle of Mons Badonicus, which established a period of peace until Gildas's lifetime. So, side note, Ambrosius Aurelianus forms the basis of one of England's most famous legends, that of King Arthur. To disappoint literally everyone, there is no compelling evidence of Arthur's existence, and what weak evidence there is was written 500 years later. Naturally, historians only have Gildas's word on this, and it should be noted he wasn't writing history, but a series of polemics which blames the state of Britain in his lifetime on the secular and religious leaders of the age. What can be said to have definitely happened was that starting from the second quarter of the 5th century, there was a settlement of peoples along the southern and eastern coast of what is now England, and by the end of the 6th century had created a series of small kingdoms. The Jutes settled Kent and the Isle of Wight, creating the kingdoms of Kent and Witwara. The Angles settled the eastern coast and the Midlands. In the north, these settlements became the kingdom of Bernicia and Deira, whilst in the south, the kingdom of East Anglia, literally meaning East Angleland, was founded. Of the middle settlements, by far the most important was the kingdom of Mercia, but there are others, such as the kingdom of Lindsey. The Saxons settled the southern coast around the Jutes, founding the kingdoms of Essex, Sussex, and Wessex, meaning East Saxons, South Saxons, and West Saxons, respectively. Thus, Britain was divided between Germanic and Brittonic kingdoms, and some Britons even fled, settling what is now called Brittany. The exact dates and natures of these foundings are essentially lost to time, but these kingdoms were firmly established by the year 600. This period is known as the Heptarchy, meaning the rule of 7, due to there being 7 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but it should be remembered that there were many more. There were also Brittonic kingdoms such as Strathclyde and Dumnonia, alongside the Welsh kingdoms of Powys and Dyfed. The cultural dividing lines between these kingdoms is hard to define, and it is difficult to know whether the Angles would have seen themselves as distinct from the Saxons. The Britons certainly saw themselves as different from the Germanic newcomers, however. One crucial difference between these two groups was religion. It is unknown how prevalent Christianity was at this time amongst the Britons, but Gildas and the Brittonic settlement at St. Alban show that Christianity was certainly alive on the island. The Germanic settlers/invaders, whatever you want to call them, were not Christians, however, they were pagans. This wasn't paganism in the Roman sense, with formal rituals and well-documented festivals, but one which varied wildly depending on who was practicing it. Germanic paganism had many gods, such as Tyr, Woden, and Thunor, who gave their names to some of the days of the week. So, in 595, Pope Gregory I sent a monk called Augustine to Britain with the intent of converting the peoples that lived there. Augustine arrived in 597, landed here at the Isle of Thanet in the Kingdom of Kent, whose capital was Canterbury. Kent at this time was ruled by King Ethelbert, and he was at first suspicious of the missionaries, thinking they were going to put a spell on him, but eventually he gave them permission to preach, and at some point, nobody knows exactly when, Ethelbert himself converted. This was not Ethelbert's first run-in with Christianity, since his wife Bertha was a Frankish princess and also a Christian. By 601, many in Kent had been converted, and Augustine was appointed as the first Archbishop of Canterbury. Ethelbert's conversion to Christianity did not just have social and religious impacts, but political ones too. The reason for this was that Ethelbert was not just the King of Kent, but also the Overlord of Britain, meaning the other kings answer to him. The position of Overlord is sometimes referred to as Bretwaldas, but actually this title was not in use until several centuries later. Ethelbert used his position of power to influence other kings to convert as well. After Ethelbert's death, the position of Overlord went to King Raedwald of East Anglia. Raedwald had previously been converted under pressure from Ethelbert, but he was not a particularly good convert since he kept both Christian and pagan shrines. Raedwald was also likely to be the man who was buried at Sutton Hoo, famous for housing this helmet. The conversion of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was not only a product of Rome, but also of the surrounding peoples. For example, the kingdom of Dalriata was home to a major monastery at Iona, founded by the Irish abbot Columba. From this monastery came Aidan, a monk who travelled to Northumbria, which is called so because it is the land north of the river Humber, which is here. He did this under the invitation of King Oswald, who had united the two kingdoms of Bernicia and Deira after a long period of assassination and warfare which had gripped the two kingdoms. Oswald, who was born a pagan, grew up as an exile in Dalriata due to the aforementioned turbulence. In return for help, he became a Christian in the Brittonic tradition. The Brittonic and Roman churches had their slight variations, but the biggest differences between them was the dating of Easter, which Bede took very seriously. Side note, the name Easter actually comes from the pagan goddess Estra, whose feast was probably held around the same time as the Christian celebration. The issues surrounding Easter were settled in Northumbria during the 664 Synod of Whitby, which was called by King Oswiu. Oswiu sided with the Roman Church's position, thus bringing Northumbria into the world of the Catholic Church. This connection to the Roman world helped open up many Northumbrian monasteries to Roman books and learning. The most notable of these monasteries was the monk Wearmouth Jarrow Abbey, which was notable because that was where Bede was educated and worked from. The century between 650 and 750 is sometimes known as the Northumbrian Renaissance or the Golden Age of Northumbria due to the increased output of literary and artistic works by its monasteries. Bede's ecclesiastical history is the best known work from monk Wearmouth Jarrow and is one of the major sources for early Anglo-Saxon history. Another major monastery was Lindisfarne, which produced the Lindisfarne Gospels but may have also produced the Book of Durrow, but nobody knows for sure. These monasteries were extremely wealthy and often sat in isolated areas along the coast to promote a holy life away from the rest of civilization. Of course, loading up these coastal monasteries with immense treasures with only monks to defend them would eventually cause problems, such as in 793 when a group of Vikings raided and looted Lindisfarne. The Northumbrian Golden Age was not just a period of artistic growth but also one of political supremacy. The Northumbrian kings Edwin, Oswald and Oswiu were all overlords of Britain and held considerable power over the southern kingdoms. One demonstration of Northumbrian power was that York was chosen as the seat of Britain's second archbishop. This period was not one of constant Northumbrian hegemony, however, since both Edwin and Oswald met their ends at the hand of Penda, the king of Mercia, who was also a pagan. Mercia had been a rising power for many decades at this point, since unlike most of the southern kingdoms it had room to expand and neighbours to loot. Penda was killed by Oswiu, who ruled over Mercia for 3 years between 655 and 658, but Mercia, under their new king, Wulfhere, revolted against him. Over the next half a century, Mercia and Northumbria would vie for dominance, with no major victor emerging. In fact, after Oswiu's short reign in Mercia, neither would ever manage to dominate the other again. So, in 716, a man called Ethelbald became the king of Mercia and managed to entrench what is called the Mercian supremacy. The exact dates for the start of the supremacy vary, but during his reign Ethelbald was able to firmly assert control over all of the southern kingdoms. This was not a simple task, since early on in his reign he was challenged by Witred of Kent and Ine of Wessex. Fortunately for Ethelbald, Witred died in 725 and his kingdom was divided between his sons, and the next year Ine abdicated to become a monk. The exact extent of Ethelbald's control over kingdoms like Kent and Wessex is debated, but throughout his life he most certainly was the most powerful king south of the Humber. Mercia did not annex the kingdoms it held hegemony over, and many operated with some independence. Ethelbald died in 757 and was succeeded by Bjornred, who was quickly chased off by Offa, the most famous king of Mercia. The hegemony established by Ethelbald had collapsed, and Offa had to reassert Mercian dominance, which he managed to do, despite some hiccups. Under Offa, the Mercian supremacy reached its height, and he brought in a series of reforms, the most notable of which was the introduction of the penny. Offa, like those before him, never managed to assert authority over the Welsh kingdoms to the west and was consistently plagued by raiding. In response, a great dyke, shockingly referred to as Offa's Dyke, was constructed running along most of the Mercian-Welsh border. It was essentially a large ditch with a mound of earth on the other side. It was no Hadrian's Wall, but it certainly would have required a lot of manpower to make. Offa's authority over Britain was recognised overseas as well, and this is demonstrated in two ways. The first is by the fact that he managed to negotiate the appointment of a third archbishop, the Archbishop of Lichfield, which is here, although please be aware it didn't last very long. Another is the letter he received from the Frankish king Charlemagne, which begins, "Charles, by the grace of God, King of the Franks and Lombards, patrician of the Romans, to his esteemed and dearest brother Offa, King of the Mercians." This shows that Offa was certainly authoritative enough to garner Charlemagne's attention, but make no mistake, Charlemagne would not have seen Offa as an equal. Just look at their kingdoms. Offa's domination of the southern kingdoms would continue until his death in 796, except for a small blip in East Anglia, which ended in Offa having the East Anglian king beheaded. After this, Mercia was ruled by a bunch of weak kings, and it never managed to really recover the same levels of authority and was consistently challenged by the other southern kingdoms. The Mercian supremacy came to a swift end in 825 at the Battle of Ellendun, in which the King of Wessex, Egbert, defeated the Mercian king Beornwulf, which ushered in the rise of Wessex. Ultimately, Mercia's primary issue was the succession, since whenever a king died, the supremacy collapsed and had to be built up again by whomever won the inevitable civil war. Offa had tried to fix this previously, but all this did was get his son killed after he died. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching. There are some recommended books in the description below and feel free to subscribe if you want.